My name is Francis, and I'm 62. On Thanksgiving morning, I stood in my small kitchen stirring gravy as the scent of sage drifted up. The radio hummed old hymns, but the house felt too quiet. My son Harold, now a millionaire, pulled into the driveway, his sleek car gleaming. He stepped out smiling and asked, "Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mum?" My heart stopped. Lake house, I'd never heard of it. Confusion hit me like a cold wind. What had I missed if a loved one's words ever left you reeling? Share where you're watching from below, and please like or subscribe to hear how this unfolds. I stood in my cramped living room, the recipe card still crumpled in my hand, its edges soft from years of handling. Harold's question about the lake house hung in the air, his smile fading as I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about a house, Harold." His brow furrowed, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees, not this polished man in a tailored coat. He repeated himself slower as if I'd misheard. "The lake house, Mum. I sent the deed last year." My chest tightened, a dull ache spreading. I hadn't seen a deed, hadn't heard a word about it. The room felt smaller, the walls lined with faded wallpaper pressing in. I turned away, pretending to adjust a crooked photo frame on the mantel. It held Harold's high school graduation picture, his grin wide and unburdened. Back then, he'd promised to buy me a big house someday. His voice full of dreams as we sat on the porch eating peach cobbler. I'd laughed, ruffling his hair, believing every word. Now those promises felt like ghosts. I glanced at him, searching for that boy, but his eyes darted to his phone, already distracted. Maybe it got lost in the mail. He said, his tone too casual, like he was brushing off a forgotten lunch date. I wanted to ask why he hadn't called, to check why he hadn't noticed my silence. Instead, I swallowed the question, my throat tight. The years stretched between us, missed birthdays, unanswered letters, visits that dwindled to nothing. I'd spent my life pouring love into him, working double shifts at the diner to pay for his college, my hands raw from scrubbing dishes. Had he forgotten? Or had he just stopped caring? I set the frame down, my fingers lingering on its cracked glass, the weight of those years pressing harder. The doorbell chimed sharp and sudden. It was Esther, my neighbor, holding a pecan pie, her silver hair tucked under a scarf. "Thought you could use this," she said, her eyes soft but searching. She'd lived next door for a decade, her own children scattered across the country, and she had a way of seeing through my forced smiles. I thanked her, setting the pie on the coffee table, its sweetness clashing with the bitterness rising in me. "Harold's here," I said, gesturing to him. She nodded, but her gaze lingered on me as if she sensed the storm brewing. "Everything all right?" Esther asked, her voice low, meant just for me. I hesitated, the truth caught in my throat. How could I explain the lake house? The confusion, the hurt. Harold was already pacing, typing something on his phone, oblivious to the tension. I forced a nod, but Esther's hand brushed mine, warm and steady, like she knew I was unraveling. "He's been busy." I said, the words hollow even to my own ears. She didn't push, just squeezed my hand before stepping back, promising to check in later. As the door closed behind her, I turned to Harold, hoping he'd say something to bridge the gap. But he was scrolling, his face lit by the screen's glow. I moved to the couch, sinking into its worn cushions, and opened a drawer in the side table. Inside was a postcard, its edges yellowed, sent by Harold during his first year at college. "I'll make it up to you, Mum." He'd written, the ink smudged but clear. I'd held onto it, a small spark of hope. Now it felt like a lie. "Harold," I said, my voice sharper than I meant. He looked up, startled. "Why didn't you tell me about this house?" He frowned, setting his phone down. But his answer was vague, something about being swamped with work. I wanted to press, to demand why he hadn't called, why he'd let me fade into the background of his life. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I clutched the postcard, its weight heavier than the pie on the table, and felt the first crack in my heart widen, a quiet, aching hollowness that threatened to swallow me whole. I set the postcard down, its words still burning in my mind, and looked at Harold, hoping for something to anchor me. He was still by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading November light. "It's a big house, Mum," he said, his voice brightening as if describing a dream. "Right by the water, with tall windows and a dock. I thought you'd love it." My stomach churned. I pictured this house I'd never seen, its grandeur a world away from my sagging porch and peeling paint. I nodded, my lips tight, afraid to speak and reveal the hurt swelling inside. I moved to the kitchen, needing something to do with my hands. The counter was cluttered with mixing bowls and a half-chopped onion, remnants of a meal I'd hoped would bring us closer. Harold followed, still talking about the lake house, its marble counters and quiet views. Each word felt like a stone piling up between us. I'd spent years saving for his future, skipping vacations, mending my own clothes to afford his textbooks. Had he thought a house could repay that? Or was it just another way to keep me at arm's length? My phone buzzed on the counter, a photo popping up from Judith, my granddaughter. She was at some glittering event, her smile wide under chandeliers, her dress shimmering. The caption read, "Wish you were here, Grandma." My heart twisted. She was Harold's daughter, yet I barely knew her. I'd sent her handmade quilts and birthday cards, but her replies were brief, her visits rare. I stared at the photo, her face so like Harold's at that age, and felt the gap between us widen, a chasm I couldn't cross. "Judith's doing well," I said, holding up the phone. Harold glanced over, his smile softening. "She's thriving," he said, but his voice carried a hint of distance, as if he too felt the strain of their world apart from mine. I wanted to ask if he'd told her about the lake house, if she knew about this supposed gift, but the question lodged in my throat, heavy with fear of the answer. Instead, I turned to the sink, rinsing a spoon under cold water, the chill seeping into my fingers. I thought of the years I'd spent waiting for Harold to come back to me. The late nights at the diner, my feet aching, my heart buoyed by the thought of his success. I'd imagined him grateful not for grand gestures, but for the small things, our Sunday pancake mornings, the way we'd laugh over old radio shows. Now he stood in my kitchen, describing a life I didn't fit into a house I'd never seen. The spoon slipped from my hand, clattering into the sink, the sound sharp in the quiet. I dried my hands on a worn dish towel, its edges frayed from years of use. Harold was still talking now about his business deals, his voice filling the space where my questions should have been. I looked at the chipped teacup on the shelf, a gift from my late husband Ronald, who'd always said, "Family's all we've got, Francis. Hold it tight." His words echoed now, a quiet rebuke. I'd held on and had Harold. Or had he let go long ago, leaving me to cling to memories? The room grew colder, the November chill creeping through the thin windows. I wrapped my sweater tighter, feeling the weight of unspoken words. Harold's phone buzzed again, and he stepped away to answer it. His voice low and urgent. I stood alone, the teacup glinting faintly in the dim light, a reminder of promises made and broken. The hollowness in my chest deepened not just from the lake house, but from the years of silence that had built up, brick by brick, until I was a stranger in my own son's life. I stood by the sink, the cold water still dripping from my hands as the front door creaked open. Marilyn stepped inside, her designer coat brushing the floor, her perfume sharp and expensive. Her smile was tight, like a mask she'd worn too long, and her eyes swept over my living room, lingering on the faded curtains. "Francis," she said, her voice syrupy. "This place is so cozy." The word stung, a polite jab at my life's simplicity. I wiped my hands on the dish towel, my fingers trembling, and forced a nod. Harold set his phone down, his face lighting up at her arrival. "Marilyn's here," he said, as if I hadn't noticed. She glided toward him, her heels clicking on the linoleum, and kissed his cheek. I turned to the dining room, busying myself with the table setting out mismatched plates and a chipped serving bowl. The radio's hymns had faded to static, mirroring the noise in my head. Marilyn's presence filled the room. Her laughter too loud, her stories of their latest trip to Europe, a stark contrast to my quiet days. I thought of the first time I met her years ago when Harold brought her home from college. She'd been charming then, her smile warm as she complimented my cooking. But I'd seen the way her eyes flicked to our modest furniture, the way she'd steer conversations to her own ambitions. I'd pushed down my unease, telling myself Harold deserved someone bright and driven. Now, as she recounted their latest gala, her voice drowned out the memory of that younger, hopeful me. "Francis, you must be so proud of Harold," Marilyn said, settling at the table. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were cold, assessing. I gripped a fork, its weight grounding me, and murmured always. The lie tasted bitter. Proud, yes, but the pride was tangled with hurt, with years of his absence. I glanced at Harold, hoping he'd sense my unease, but he was nodding at Marilyn, caught in her orbit. The phone in my pocket buzzed a call from Beatrice, my oldest friend. I stepped into the hallway, grateful for the excuse. Her voice was warm, laced with concern. "How's it going with Harold?" she asked. I leaned against the wall, staring at a faded watercolor painting, a gift from my late sister. "It's complicated," I said, my voice low. Beatrice sighed, her own children distant, her words heavy with shared understanding. "Don't let him forget you," she said. I nodded, though she couldn't see the weight of her words settling deep. Back in the dining room, Marilyn was steering the conversation. dismissing the lake house confusion with a wave of her hand. "Oh, Francis, it's probably just a mix-up," she said, her smile unwavering. "You know how busy we are." Her words cut deeper than they should have, each one a reminder of my place outside their world. I set a bowl of mashed potatoes on the table, my hands steady, but my heart racing. I wanted to ask about the deed, to demand answers, but the fear of pushing Harold away kept me silent. I thought of the late nights I'd spent worrying about him, checking my phone for messages that never came. The care packages I'd sent, filled with cookies and handwritten notes, returned with perfunctory thanks, or none at all. Marilyn's voice droned on her stories of charity events and boardroom deals, a wall between us. I looked at the table, the food I'd spent hours preparing, and felt a pang of futility. Had I been cooking for a family that no longer existed? The static on the radio grew louder, a grating hum that matched the tension in my chest. Marilyn's laughter rang out sharp and unyielding as she recounted another triumph. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, the unspoken questions piling up like dishes in the sink. How had it come to this? How had my son? My heart become a stranger in a suit, standing beside a woman who saw me as less than the dust on her coat. I pushed the mashed potatoes around my plate, the fork heavy in my hand as Marilyn's voice filled the dining room. She was talking about their new yacht. Now her words polished and sharp, cutting through the air. Harold nodded along his eyes, fixed on her as if she held the only light in the room. I sat across from them, the table, a barrier, my carefully prepared meal untouched. The cranberry sauce glistened in its bowl, a deep red, that reminded me of the lipstick stains on the collars of Ronald's shirts back when I still believed in second chances. I tried to focus on the food, on the familiar act of serving, but Marilyn's comment about family loyalty landed like a slap. "It's so important to stick together," she said, her gaze sliding to me, her smile thin. I froze the serving spoon, hovering over the green beans. Did she know how those words twisted inside me? How they mocked the years I'd spent waiting for Harold to call, to visit, to remember I was still here. I set the spoon down, my hands shaking, and reached for my water glass, hoping to steady myself. The locket in my pocket pressed against my thigh. A small weight I'd slipped from the jewelry box that morning. It held a photo of Harold as a toddler, his chubby hands reaching for me. I'd worn it often in those early years, a reminder of the boy who'd clung to me. Now it felt like a relic of a life I'd lost. I glanced at Harold, hoping for a flicker of recognition, but he was laughing at something Marilyn said. His voice distant, unfamiliar. The doorbell rang, a brief reprieve. It was Lloyd, my cousin. His coat dusted with early snow. He carried a bottle of cider, his smile warm but cautious. "Thought I'd drop by," he said, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Marilyn's stiff posture. Lloyd had known Harold as a boy, had taught him how to tie a tie for his first school dance. Now he stood in the doorway, a bridge to a past we'd all shared. "Smells good, Francis," he said. But his tone carried a question, as if he sensed the storm brewing. I thanked him, setting the cider on the table, but Marilyn's voice cut through again. "Oh, how quaint," she said. eyeing the bottle like it was a thrift store find. Lloyd's smile faltered, and I felt a surge of protectiveness for him, for us, for the life we'd built without her approval. I wanted to snap back to tell her this house, this meal, this family was enough. But the words caught, tangled in years of keeping peace, of biting my tongue to keep Harold close. Lloyd stayed only a moment, his presence a fleeting comfort. As he left, he squeezed my shoulder, whispering, "You're stronger than you think." His words lingered, but they couldn't pierce the fog of hurt settling over me. I returned to the table where Marilyn was now talking about their plans for a winter home in Florida. Harold listened, his fork poised, oblivious to the way her words carved at me, each one a reminder of my place outside their world. I thought of the apron hanging in the kitchen, its stitches a gift from my sister who died too young. She'd said family was worth fighting for. But what did that mean when the fight felt one-sided? I'd poured my life into Harold, into this idea of us, only to find myself sitting at a table where I didn't belong. Marilyn's laughter rang out again, sharp as glass, and I felt the weight of her dismissal, her control, her theft of my son. The air grew thick, my breath shallow as the truth pressed closer. I was losing him, and I'd been losing him for years. The dining room felt like a held breath, the air thick with Marilyn's latest story about a charity auction. I pushed a slice of turkey across my plate, its edges dry, the meal forgotten. Then her voice shifted, casual but deliberate, as she said, "We made a good profit selling that lake house, didn't we, Harold?" My fork stopped mid-air. Selling it. Harold's face drained of colour, his eyes darting to me, then to her. "What do you mean, sold?" he asked, his voice low, unsteady. I set my fork down, my hands cold, the room tilting. "What house?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I never got any house." The words hung heavy, slicing through the hum of the radio's static. Marilyn's smile froze, her eyes narrowing, but she recovered quickly, laughing it off. "Oh, Francis, you must have forgotten," she said, her tone syrupy, dismissive. But Harold wasn't laughing. He leaned forward, his chair creaking. "Marilyn, I sent the deed to Mom last spring." The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that swallows sound and time. I stared at Marilyn, her perfectly manicured hands, folding a napkin, her composure cracking at the edges. "It was better managed by us," she said finally, her voice cool, as if explaining a business decision. "I had the deed redirected. You were so busy, Harold. I handled it." My breath caught a sharp pain blooming in my chest. Redirected. She'd stolen it, my son's gift, my dream, and sold it without a word. I thought of Ronald, my late husband, his voice rough from years of factory work, warning me about people who smile too easily. "Watch the ones who talk over you," he'd said, his hand warm on mine. I'd ignored him, wanting to believe in Marilyn's charm, in Harold's happiness. Now that memory burned a quiet accusation. I gripped the edge of the tablecloth, its worn threads rough under my fingers, anchoring me as the truth sank in. Judith burst through the door, her coat dusted with snow, her face flushed from the cold. "Sorry I'm late, Grandma," she said, her voice bright, unaware of the storm in the room. She stopped, sensing the tension, her eyes flicking between us. "What's going on?" she asked, her backpack sliding to the floor. I wanted to shield her, to keep her from this ugliness, but the truth was spilling out unstoppable. Harold's voice broke the silence, tight with anger. "Marilyn, you didn't tell me you sold it." Marilyn's laugh was brittle now, her eyes darting to Judith, then back to Harold. "It was just paperwork, darling." Frances didn't need the hassle. Her words were a blade cutting deeper with each syllable. "Didn't need I'd spent my life building a home for Harold, scraping by, giving him everything. And she'd taken this from me, from us, as if my place in their world was negotiable." My hands trembled, the silver spoon on the table, glinting a wedding gift from my parents, now a witness to this betrayal. I wanted to scream, to demand why she thought she could erase me. But my voice stayed trapped, years of silence holding it hostage. Judith stepped closer. Her brow furrowed, looking so much like Harold at her age that my heart ached. "Grandma," she said, her voice small, searching. I couldn't answer. Couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of everything I'd lost. Not just the house, but the years, the connection, the family I'd fought to keep. Marilyn's eyes met mine, defiant, and I saw it then, the truth she'd hidden, the control she'd wielded, and the son she'd pulled away from me. Marilyn's defiance hung in the air, her eyes locked on mine, daring me to speak. The dining room was the pressure cooker, the turkey cold, the candles flickering low. Harold's voice cracked as he pressed her. "You handled it without telling me." His hands gripped the table knuckles, pale. Marilyn shrugged, her lips curling. "You were too busy, Harold. Someone had to make decisions." Her words were a slap, dismissing him as easily as she'd dismissed me. I felt the ground shift, years of buried hurt, rising like floodwater. I stood my chair, scraping the floor, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "You think I'm nothing, Marilyn? Just some old woman you can erase?" The words spilled out raw and unfiltered, each one a release of decades of silence. I worked my hands raw for him, for this family. And you sold what was mine. My voice trembled, not with fear, but with a fury I hadn't known I carried. Harold's eyes widened, his face a mix of shock and shame. Judith stepped back, her hands clutching her coat, her eyes darting between us. Marilyn's composure shattered, her voice sharp. "Don't be dramatic, Frances. It was just a house. You're fine here." Fine. The word was a knife twisting in the wound. This house, with its creaking floors and chipped paint, held every sacrifice I'd made, every late shift, every skipped meal, every prayer for Harold's future. And she'd reduced it to nothing. I thought of the letter I'd found last week, tucked in an old book on my nightstand. Harold's handwriting from years ago, apologizing for drifting away, promising to visit. He'd never sent it, never followed through. I'd kept it hoping it meant something, but now it felt like another broken thread. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry, not in front of her. Marilyn leaned forward, her voice low, venomous. "You should be grateful for what Harold's become. Not everyone gets a son like him." The room spun her words, a public stripping of my worth. I saw every moment I'd let pass, every call I didn't make. Every question I didn't ask, afraid of losing him. Judith's voice broke through, small and shaking. "Mom, stop." But Marilyn ignored her, her gaze fixed on me as if she could will me into insignificance. Harold sat frozen, his silence louder than her words, a betrayal deeper than the lake house itself. I clutched the edge of the table, my fingers brushing a small glass vase, a gift from my mother, its delicate etchings worn smooth by time. It held the weight of her love, her strength. Everything Marilyn mocked, I wanted to hurl it, to shatter this facade, but my body wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, my voice spent as the truth laid bare the family I'd lost. Marilyn's smirk, Harold's silence, Judith's confusion. They were a mirror reflecting every choice I'd made to stay quiet, to hope to wait. And now I was empty, the pieces of me scattered across this table with no way to put them back together. The dining room was still, the air heavy with the echo of Marilyn's words and Harold's silence. I stood gripping the table, the glass vase cool under my fingers, its weight a reminder of what I'd held on to. My heart pounded, but something shifted inside me. A spark, small but fierce, refusing to let Marilyn's smirk be the last word. I looked at Harold, his head bowed, and Judith, her eyes wide with questions. I couldn't stay silent anymore, not after years of swallowing my voice. I let go of the table and walked to the hallway, my steps steady despite the ache in my chest. "Harold," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Meet me tomorrow at the diner on Maple Street. Just you. We need to talk." He looked up, startled, his mouth opening, but I raised a hand, cutting him off. "No excuses. 9 o'clock. Marilyn's eyes narrowed, but I didn't look at her. This wasn't her moment. Back in my bedroom that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the single lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. The quiet was a relief after the dining room's storm. I opened a box under my bed filled with old photos and letters, each one a piece of the life I'd built for Harold. I pulled out a snapshot of us at a county fair. Him, 6 years old, his face sticky with cotton candy, my arm around him. My throat tightened, but I kept digging, needing to face the past to move forward. I found a drawing tucked between faded envelopes, its crayon lines uneven but clear. A house by a lake labelled for Mum in Harold's childish scrawl. I'd forgotten it, buried under years of routine and hope. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, her words from long ago when I doubted myself. "Stand tall, Francis, even when it hurts." I traced the drawing's edges, the paper brittle but intact, and felt her strength in me, urging me to reclaim what was mine. Not just the lake house, but my place in Harold's life. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Beatrice, her voice soft but steady. "You okay after tonight?" she asked. I hesitated, then told her about the lake house, Marilyn's betrayal, my plan to meet Harold. She listened, then shared a story of her own. A fight with her daughter years ago, resolved only when she spoke her truth. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "Don't let fear stop you." Her words settled deep, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. I spread the photos across my bed, each one a memory of Harold. His first bike, his prom the day he left for college. I'd given him everything, not for grand gestures, but for moments like these now faded to sepia. I picked up the drawing again, its simple lines a promise he'd made, and broken. But I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who waited, who hoped, who stayed quiet. I folded the drawing carefully, slipping it into my purse. Tomorrow I'd show it to him, not to guilt him, but to remind us both of who we'd been. The lamp flickered, casting a warm glow over the room. I felt a quiet resolve growing, not loud or angry, but steady like the roots of the oak outside my window. I'd spent too long letting Marilyn's world define mine, letting Harold's absence shape my days. Tomorrow I'd speak not just for the lake house, but for every unspoken hurt, every lost year. I turned off the lamp, the darkness soft around me, and felt the spark inside flare brighter, ready to light the way. The morning air was crisp as I walked to the diner on Maple Street, the crayon drawing tucked in my purse, its weight a quiet anchor. The diner's neon sign flickered its booths, worn but familiar, the scent of coffee and bacon wrapping around me like an old friend. I slid into a corner booth, the vinyl creaking under me, and ordered a black coffee, its bitterness sharp on my tongue. I watched the door, my hands steady, but my heart racing, waiting for Harold. He arrived on time, his suit out of place among the diner's chipped mugs and formica tables. He slid in across from me, his eyes tired shadows pooling beneath them. "Mum," he started, but I held up a hand, my voice calm but unyielding. "No interruptions, Harold. I need you to listen." I pulled the drawing from my purse, smoothing it on the table. His eyes widened, recognizing the lake house he'd sketched as a boy, the promise he'd made. "I raised you alone." I said my words deliberate, each one a stone laid carefully. I worked nights, skipped meals, wore the same coat for a decade to give you a future. And you let her take that lake house, let her take you from me. My voice didn't waver, though my chest ached. Harold looked down, his fingers tracing the drawing's edges, his silence heavy with guilt. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on his. "Why didn't you call? Why didn't you check if I got the deed?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping. "I was scared," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Marilyn, she handles everything. I thought she'd told you." His words stung, but they also cracked open something in me, a clarity I'd buried under years of hoping. I wasn't just fighting Marilyn. I was fighting his surrender and my own. The diner's owner, Clarence, approached with a coffee pot. His apron stained, his smile gentle. "You two okay?" he asked, refilling my cup. I nodded, but his eyes lingered, kind but knowing. He'd told me once about his own son, estranged for years, and how a single honest conversation had brought them back. "Takes guts to talk," he'd said. Now his quiet presence bolstered me, a reminder that truth could rebuild what silence had broken. I pushed the drawing closer to Harold. "This was us," I said, my voice softer now, but firm. "I want that back. Not the house, not your money, but you. Judith, too. We start with honesty right here." He nodded, his eyes glistening. And for the first time I saw the boy who'd promised me the world, not the man who'd drifted away. I felt a weight lift, not fully, but enough to breathe. The diner hummed around us, waitresses, calling orders, plates clinking. I sipped my coffee, its warmth spreading through me, and set my cup down with a soft clink. No more letting Marilyn decide, I said, my eyes never leaving his. You owe me that. Harold nodded again. His hand resting on the drawing, a silent vow. I leaned back, the booth's vinyl cool against my back, and felt a quiet strength settle in my bones. Not loud, not angry, but unshakable, like the steady tick of the diner's clock on the wall. The diner's clock ticked softly as I left Harold's promise lingering in the air, his hand still on the drawing. I walked home through the crisp morning, the town quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots. My breath clouded in the cold, but inside I felt a shift, like a locked door creaking open. Harold's visits began the next week, just him, no Marilyn. He'd bring coffee, sit on my sagging porch swing, and talk small things at first, like his favorite books from childhood or Judith's latest art project. Each word was a thread, stitching us back together. I set up a folding table in the backyard, where we'd share muffins and watch the sparrows dart through the bare trees. Harold's face softened here, away from his glass and steel world. He admitted Marilyn controlled their finances, the lake house funds tucked into her accounts. I didn't know, Mom. He said, his voice heavy, eyes fixed on the cracked mug in his hands. I nodded, my throat tight, not ready to forgive, but listening. One afternoon, Judith joined us, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She was hesitant, her smile shy, but she sat beside me, sketching the old oak in my yard. You used to draw like this, I said, my voice soft, remembering her toddler scribbles on my fridge. She glanced at Harold, then at me, her eyes searching. I want to know you, Grandma, she said, barely audible. My heart swelled, but a pang followed, years lost to distance, to Marilyn's shadow. I thought of a summer long ago, when Harold and Judith built a fort in this same backyard, their laughter echoing as Ronald grilled burgers nearby. The memory was vivid, the scent of charcoal sharp in my mind. Now, as Harold talked about his business, his voice carried guilt, a confession of letting Marilyn steer their lives. I'm trying to fix it, he said, his fingers tracing the mug's handle. I wanted to believe him, but the hurt lingered, a quiet bruise. Judith's pencil scratched softly, her presence a fragile bridge. I watched her, wondering what she knew of her mother's choices. Harold's visits were a start, but Marilyn's absence loomed, a question unanswered. I poured more coffee, the steam rising, and felt the weight of what was coming. I'd opened the door, but the path ahead was uncertain, each step a risk. I looked at the rosebush I'd planted near the fence, its buds still tight, and felt a stillness settle over me, a quiet pause before the storm I knew was brewing. The backyard table was cleared, the mugs washed and stacked, but the air felt heavier as the days passed. Harold's visits continued, his presence a fragile tether, but Marilyn's shadow loomed larger. One evening, she showed up unannounced, her car idling in my driveway, her face a mask of controlled fury. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie when she knocked her wrap sharp against the door. I opened it. My apron dusted with flour and met her gaze unflinching. "Francis," she said, stepping inside without invitation, her heels clicking on my worn floor. "You're causing trouble." Her voice was low-edged with accusation, as if I'd trespassed into her world. I set the knife down, its blade glinting under the fluorescent light, and wiped my hands, my heart steady but cold. "I'm talking to my son." I said, my words measured, each one deliberate. "That's not trouble. That's family." She laughed a brittle sound and leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning my modest kitchen. "You're filling his head with nonsense," she said. "He's questioning me now, digging into accounts." "Because of you." Her words landed like stones, but I didn't flinch. I thought of the journal I'd found in my closet, its pages filled with entries from my 40s when Harold's calls grew rare. "He's drifting." I'd written my pen heavy with fear. Now that fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve, I stepped closer, my voice low. "You took a house meant for me, Marilyn. You sold it. That's not nonsense." Her eyes flickered a crack in her armor, but she straightened her smile, returning sharp and cold. "You're too old for grudges, Francis. Let it go." The dismissal stung, but it also clarified something. She saw me as an obstacle, not a mother, not a person. I held her gaze, my silence louder than her words, and felt the weight of my own power reclaimed after years of giving it away. Lloyd stopped by the next day, his truck rattling into the driveway. He carried a folder of legal contacts, his face lined with concern. "Heard about Marilyn's visit," he said, settling at my kitchen table. "You holding up?" I nodded, pouring him tea, but my hands trembled slightly, betraying the storm inside. Lloyd's stories of his own family fights, of bridges rebuilt and burned, grounded me. "You're doing right by speaking up," he said, his voice firm. "Don't stop now." I looked out the window. The rosebush's buds still closed, unmoved by the late fall chill. Harold hadn't called since Marilyn's visit, his silence a new kind of ache. I wondered if I'd pushed too far, if my demand for truth had cost me the fragile connection we'd begun to rebuild. The kitchen was quiet. The pie half finished, its apples browning on the counter. I sat, my hands folded, and felt the weight of my choice settle in. Not regret, but a heavy stillness, like the moment before a storm breaks, leaving me to wonder if I'd gained my voice only to lose my son again. The kitchen was quiet, the apples still untouched on the counter, their edges curling brown. I sat at the table, a mug of tea cooling in my hands, the steam curling upward like a faint prayer. Harold's silence had stretched into days, each one heavier than the last. But I felt different now. Not broken, but steady, like the old maple outside my window, weathered, but standing. I'd spoken my truth, and though the cost was unclear, the weight of silence no longer crushed me. I planned a small gathering, just Harold and Judith, no Marilyn. I called Harold, my voice calm, leaving a message about Sunday lunch. "Bring Judith." I said, "We'll keep it simple." He didn't reply, but Judith texted back her words. Bright. I'll be there, Grandma. I smiled, setting the phone down, and felt a warmth spread small but real like sunlight breaking through clouds. That afternoon I walked to the backyard, the grass crisp under my shoes. I knelt by the flower bed, tucking bulbs into the cold earth, their promise of spring hidden beneath the dirt. I thought of my father, his hands rough from carpentry, teaching me to plant tulips when I was a girl. Patience, Francis. He'd said, his voice steady, things grow when you give them time. His words returned now, a quiet comfort, reminding me that healing wasn't rushed. Judith arrived early Sunday, her laughter filling the house as she helped me set the table. She placed wildflowers in a mason jar, their colors soft against the linen cloth. Dad's coming, she said, her eyes bright but cautious. I nodded, stirring a pot of soup, its warmth filling the kitchen. Harold's truck pulled up and he stepped inside, his face lined but softer, carrying a loaf of bread from the bakery. Smells like home, he said, his voice tentative, a peace offering. We sat in the living room, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. Harold talked about Judith's art, her dreams of studying abroad. I listened, my hands folded, feeling the distance between us shrink, not gone, but less jagged. I thought of my father again, his quiet faith in time, and realized I was forgiving Harold, not erasing the hurt, but letting it rest. Judith's laughter. Harold's hesitant smile. They were enough for now, a fragile start. Esther stopped by her scarf, loose, a plate of cookies in hand. Looks like a family, she said, her eyes warm, lingering on us. She'd lost her own son years ago, reconciled only near the end, and her presence felt like a blessing, a reminder of what could be salvaged. We sipped tea, the room filled with soft voices, and I felt a stillness settle, not perfect, but real, like the bulbs waiting beneath the earth, ready to bloom when the time was right. The living room glowed with the last of the afternoon light, the soup bowls empty. Judith's wildflowers drooping slightly in their jar. Esther had left her cookies half-eaten, her quiet smile lingering in my mind. I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, the water warm against my hands. Harold and Judith sat on the couch, their voices low, planning a trip to the coast. I listened, not joining in, but feeling their presence like a soft weight, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I dried my hands and walked to the hall, pausing at a small shelf where a wooden box sat, its lid carved with ivy. Inside was a thin bracelet, silver and simple, a gift from my mother when I turned 30. She'd clasped it on my wrist, her fingers trembling, and said, "Wear it when you need to remember you're enough." I hadn't worn it in decades, its shine dulled by time. Now I slipped it on the metal, cool against my skin, a quiet reminder of my own strength. I thought of the evenings I'd spent alone, the house silent. Except for the hum of the fridge, my heart heavy with questions about Harold. Those nights had carved lines in me, but they'd also taught me to stand, to wait, to keep going. I looked at Harold now, his head bent toward Judith, his laugh softer than I remembered. I didn't need him to be the boy he'd been, or to undo the years apart. I needed him here now, and he was. Beatrice called later, her voice crackling through the phone. "You sound different," she said, her words careful but warm. I told her about the lunch, about Judith's sketches. Harold's tentative steps back. She shared a letter she'd written to her daughter, never sent, but written to let go of old pain. "Sometimes it's enough to just speak," she said. I nodded, the bracelet glinting as I moved, and felt her words settle a truth I was beginning to live. I stepped outside, the evening air, sharp, the sky streaked with pink. The bulbs I'd planted waited beneath the soil, their growth invisible but certain. I thought of my mother's hands guiding mine in the dirt, her voice steady through my doubts. Forgiveness wasn't a grand gesture. It was this standing here, watching the light fade, knowing I'd chosen to speak, to mend, to let the past rest. I looked back at the house, its windows warm, Harold and Judith's shadows moving inside, and felt a quiet peace, like the soft close of a book. Its story not finished, but resting for now. The morning sun filtered through my kitchen curtains, casting soft stripes across the table where I sat with a notebook, its pages fresh and unlined. Months had passed since that tense Thanksgiving, and the house felt different now, still modest, still creaky, but warmer lived in. I'd started writing again small notes about my days, a habit I'd abandoned years ago when life felt too heavy. Today I jotted down a memory of a sparrow landing on the feeder outside its quick wings, a quiet joy. Harold's visits had become steady, not grand, but regular, like the rhythm of seasons. He'd come by with Judith, sometimes alone, bringing stories of his work or her latest sketches. We'd sit in the living room, the couch sagging under us, and talk about simple things, the weather, a new recipe, her dreams of art school. Marilyn's presence had faded, her name rarely mentioned, her control loosening as Harold found his voice. I didn't ask about the lake house funds. They were his to untangle now. I walked to the porch, a mug of tea in hand, and watched the street wake up. Esther was sweeping her walkway, her scarf bright against the grey morning. She waved her smile, a shared understanding of time's slow healing. I thought of my childhood friend Shirley, who'd moved away decades ago, but sent a card last week, her handwriting shaky but warm. "You're still here," she'd written, and I felt it now, a rootedness I'd almost forgotten. The notebook lay open, my pen resting beside it. I'd written about the sparrow, but also about the ache of those silent years, the way I'd let fear keep me quiet. I wasn't that woman anymore. Speaking to Harold, facing Marilyn, had cracked something open, letting light into places I'd kept dark. I sipped my tea, its warmth spreading, and felt a quiet pride, not in winning, but in choosing to stand, to claim my place in my own story. Judith's laughter drifted from the backyard where she was sketching the neighbor's dog. Harold joined her, his voice low, teasing her about her smudged pencils. I stayed on the porch, letting their sounds wash over me, a balm on old wounds. The air was cool, the day just beginning, and I felt a stillness, not perfect, but enough like the pause before a new page turns ready for whatever comes next. I closed the notebook and walked to the living room, where a small shelf held my mother's old recipe box, its wood scratched but sturdy. I opened it, the hinges creaking, and found not just recipes but notes she'd tucked inside, bits of advice scribbled in her slanted hand. One read, "Hold love lightly, Francis. It stays when you don't grip too tight." I smiled my fingers, brushing the paper, her wisdom settling into me like a long-forgotten song. I'd spent years clutching at Harold at the idea of family, afraid to lose it. Now I was learning to let go, not of love, but of the need to control it. Harold and Judith were still in the backyard, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves. I joined them carrying a tray of lemonade, the glasses clinking softly. Judith showed me her sketch, the dog's ears captured in quick, sure lines. Harold watched her, pride in his eyes, and I saw a man trying, not perfect, but present. I didn't need the lake house or the years I'd lost. I needed this us here, rebuilding on our own terms. Lloyd dropped by his truck, parked crookedly, a basket of apples in hand. "For your pies," he said, his grin warm. We sat together, the four of us, under the oak tree, its branches bare but strong. Lloyd shared a story of his own reconciliation with a brother, years of silence mended by a single letter. His words echoed my mother's note, a reminder that love grows in the spaces we leave open, not the ones we force closed. I looked at the recipe box, later alone in the kitchen, and slipped one of Judith's sketches inside her dog, joining my mother's notes. It felt right, a new layer in our family's story. The pain of that Thanksgiving of Marilyn's betrayal hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined me. I'd learned that silence can wound as much as words, that speaking, even when it shakes you, is how you claim your life. I wasn't whole because the hurt was gone, but because I'd faced it, chosen to stand, and found peace in the choosing. The evening settled, the sky a soft grey, the house quiet but alive with traces of the day. Judith's laughter, Harold's stories, Lloyd's steady presence. I stood at the window, the glass cool against my palm, and felt time stretch before me, not heavy, but open. I'd carried my family's weight for so long, but now I carried myself too lighter, steadier, ready for whatever came next. What truth have you held back, afraid to speak? Share it below if you're ready. It's a step toward healing. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, or share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for listening, for being here with me. May you find your own quiet strength wherever you are.